This is Let's Talk About Myths, baby, and I am your host, Liv. And I am here with another conversation episode. So back in, it was probably August, early September, Michaela and I sat down and recorded a ton of conversations with loads of incredible people, which has worked out really well because as I'm moving across the country, I'm realizing that when a person has ADHD and their apartment is completely packed up / everywhere all the time and all you can think about is a ridiculously long distance drive, it just turns out that like brains don't work very well. So I'm thrilled to have these conversations that were already recorded for you all, and today's is something special. I spoke with Cecily Bateman, who studies, lots of things that were utterly interesting, but their main one for today's episode is disability in the ancient Roman world. Spoilers / trigger warning, the ancient Roman world had very, very, constructed... there's a lot of enslavement. You can see what I mean about the brain. That's my trigger warning. There's an enormous amount of talking about enslaved people in the Roman world because it's Rome. And, they just made a real habit out of it. But we had an absolutely fascinating conversation. We might slightly devolve into a rant about capitalism. Surprise, surprise. But ultimately, oh my God, my conversation with Cecily was absolutely wonderful. So sit back and enjoy. Conversations. The horrors persist. Disability in the ancient Roman world with Cecily Bateman. Honestly, Michaela and I were going through, possible guests for the show, and we literally just saw the words like disability in the ancient world, and I was like, yep, okay, perfect. Like, I always want to hear about that. I've covered it here and there, specifically though more so in Greece. So I love that you study disability in Rome. What led you into that? Like, what do you study exactly? How do we know about disabled people in Rome? Like, it's so interesting.
Yeah, no, it's incredible, and right now disability studies in classics it's just about to have its moment. Like, early career scholars and mid-career scholars are just starting to release these incredible hard-hitting monographs and edited collections. So it's a really exciting time.
Yeah.
I got into thinking about disability because of my experience as a disabled scholar, and this was when I was starting my master's. I wrote an essay on the intersection of disability and slavery in Roman law. And you might think, oh my God, thinking about law is so boring. Actually, you know what? Roman law has a lot of really interesting bits. So that was really fun.
I'm willing to bet. I'm willing to bet it has ridiculous things. Like, I've heard some stuff on Athenian law, and actually I realize I think in line with disability as well. And Athenian law is wild, so I can only imagine Roman law is wilder.
yeah, they were on some intense stuff then. But I don't know. I could think about classics and how I do my scholarship in quite a political way, and then I'm going, okay, how can this contribute to classics, but also how can this contribute to the world and wider things? And I think that's something that's really important with humanities academia. And I think that studying disability in the ancient world has these really fascinating implications for disability activism and disability studies today. People like Marcella Ward and Hannah Silverblank, they've talked about how so many ableist tropes have their kind of roots in the ancient world. So use of disability as metaphor. Marcella Ward's just put out this book on blindness in ancient theatre.
As if she wasn't already on my list of people to get on.
Yeah, as if she wasn't already completely iconic.
I've literally had her on the list for a while now, and I'm like, okay, well, add another reason. All right, we're just
we're tally mark.
Yeah, we're Twitter friends. I just got to actually make the move.
Oh yeah, no, she'll be a fantastic guest. Yeah. But yeah, she talks about how this makes these tropes seem like these timeless things that are essential to human nature that we can't escape. And you're like, no, we must unpick how all these, they're contingent, they're constructed, they're reconstructed in all these different moments. And by unpicking that, you kind of shake the ground that they stand on in terms of being these things that we supposedly can't change.
Yeah.
And for ancient disability, like, I mean, this is where it kind of overlaps with my PhD research, which is actually on the far right and classics.
Oh my god. Well,
yeah,
okay. Feel free to dive into that at all too.
All my research is just laugh a minute stuff, you know. We're having a fun quest over here.
I bet.
Light and breezy. But like a lot of it, and it does kind of go into mainstream discussions today, especially around kind of like state welfare spending. There's this idea that disabled people today, they should be like so grateful for how we have it. You know, in the ancient world, disabled people would have been left to die or like ostracized and perish. So, you know, you shouldn't complain about, you know, you should just think about how good you have it. But obviously disability history shows that this is just completely untrue. You know, disabled people have been like crucial actors.
Absolutely. But also, like, just from a personal standpoint, my younger sister has been disabled by chronic migraines for the past, like, 8 years. Mm-hmm. Like, literally all of the time she has a headache. And so, and literally just last week, she got denied for disability by the government of Canada. And even, like, and it's so wild. And, like, the little like, thing said, you know, that like disability is not determining whether you can work in society. It's determining whether you can care for yourself. And so she got denied because she can care for herself, but like that's literally all she can do. It's like it's so wild the way they treat these things. And so I didn't realize like that connection was going to come to me, but like obviously it would. But it just, yeah, it makes me so angry just as like the older sister of somebody dealing with this. But like when it comes to like that argument that you said, you know, like about saying like, oh, well, it's better than in the classical world. Like, I feel like that argument is used for so many things that are it's so fucking wild, because it's also like, even if that was true, which it isn't, like, why would that make it okay? Like, why would that, like, just because it's not the absolute worst doesn't make something good or functioning.
Yeah, well, I think it ties into this whole idea of like return to this state of humanity where we're untainted by modernity. We return to man's like natural instincts, and then everybody is somehow, you know, great and the you know, like the warriors of ancient Greece or whatever. But again, it's not true. Like, disabled people they've been obviously actors, they've been accepted in their communities. But what I like to think about when we think about ancient disability in the past is kind of using it as a tool to think further about the relationships between disability and other social and economic structures. Because, I mean, a lot of disability theory and scholarship today obviously talks about capitalism and the modern world, and how, you know, like your sister with work, they're like, oh, if you can't work, you're the bad disabled person, or you must get disabled people into work. But we won't actually make allowances.
Yeah, no, and you won't like help them if they can't work, even though they're
yeah.
And certainly, even if you get on disability, it doesn't actually match like the cost of living in this country. Oh my god! Like, I swear, like even if she had been, you know, accepted, it would have been like it wouldn't have even paid her rent a month, and she has incredibly cheap, quote unquote, cheap rent for like where we live, you know. Sorry, now I'm like turning it into like, oh my god, I'm the angry older sister. I didn't realize it was going to connect so much, but yeah.
I feel like it takes like a 5 minutes with a brush with any kind of state disability bureaucracy for you to just be like, this is a nightmare. This is a Byzantine labyrinth of cruelty.
Yeah. It's great. Capitalism is doing awesome. We're all fine.
We're having a great time.
Absolutely.
All going great.
It's definitely not in its death throes, and we're all suffering under it.
Oh my god, yeah. And I mean, this kind of links back to what I think. I know you and Kyle discussed probably about 3 years ago now, but you know, I recently listened to it.
Yeah. Like I keep thinking about. I was like, it was a long ago. Yeah.
Yeah, like the different models of disability, like the social model. So I'll quickly go over that. So like the medical model is a kind of outdated model that goes, okay, how do we fix people so they can interact with the environment better? So, okay, person who uses a wheelchair, we're going to try and make you walk, or instead of putting ramps so you can get around in a way that's not painful to you, or a way that's like your preferred method. And then there's the social model, which I'm really interested in, which looks at how different structures and institutions disable some people and enable others. So it's really like it's not so much about bodies, it's about like the society and who it's accommodating and who it's not. So that's what I kind of look at.
Mm-hmm.
And that really came forward in, so I have two kind of projects on disability. So one, this project on disability and slavery in Roman law, and another that I'm working on, which is this comparison between the display of disabled bodies in the Roman Empire and Victorian freak shows in the British Empire, and how it's used to construct these ideas of normalcy and this relationship of empire, and like the imperial core is the people who look at the other, who are very different, and how the kind of imperial core of Rome deals with the disabled people that are born in Rome, because obviously disabled people are born everywhere.
Yeah.
There's this one, I think it's in Suetonius. He records, I find this really interesting in terms of how disability is constructed socially. So Augustus was praised for displaying all kinds of oddities across the empire. I know. Some of this is animals. Such a great guy. Such a model for what we want to be doing. Yeah. So he would display animals, people. There would be like the tallest person and the smallest person. But Suetonius notes that Augustus didn't display people of respectable parentage. Apart from one exception. You're like, okay, already this is fascinating. So, I mean, by putting someone on display, you're making their body into a spectacle. There's no such thing as a body that's inherently freakish. I think in disability studies they call it infrequent.
Wow.
Which is, they position a disabled body, or a body that society at that particular moment has decided is outside of the normal, next to a normate body to create the spectacle and underlie the differences. And obviously, like, if you turn to Victorian Britain, this is super racialized. So you'd have people from across the British Empire being displayed and like made into a spectacle. It's not just this kind of objective display of bodies. Like, one example that I find really interesting, it's a guy called Mohamed Bou. So I think the it's French, it's spelled Baux, who was a person with dwarfism from India, who exhibited himself, which is actually more common than one might think. This is around kind of the 1860s. And all the time, his identity is this multiply othered person. It's someone who's Indian and someone who's disabled is constructed in the leaflets. He was called the miniature man of India. India at this time is obviously a British colony, and everything about his presentation underlies this English anxiety about controlling the colonies. Like, the adverts have him wearing a British military officer's outfit, and this kind of like showing the effective management of the colonies via adoption of British dress, and like literally moving people from the colonies to the imperial core to then put them on display as this ultimate like display of control over everyone's bodies. So yeah, sorry, I was complete ramble there.
Not at all. I mean, it's fascinating. It's just fucking empire. Just makes me go
Yeah, and so Augustus is doing a similar thing, but he won't make a spectacle out of people with respectable parentage. He won't make a spectacle out of his own upper class. And I think that's really interesting in how disability and class in the ancient world, how that's constructed. Like, for the upper classes, disability is something that is the exception. It's something that disrupts their self-image and self-portrayal of superiority, and that's why you hear so much about upper-class figures who were disabled, like Claudius. They talk a lot about it, stutter, etc., etc., and that's such a big deal. Whereas, obviously, disability and impairment in lower-class people would have been super common, given the physical labor, malnutrition, no, obviously not modern medicine. So it's a hugely like disabling environment, but that depends on your relationship to labor and what kind of labor you're doing. Yeah, disability is it's all wrapped up in everything.
Yeah. Well, and like, I mean, Rome is always so wild. It's also like, obviously not the thing I focus on a lot, but I love when people come on to tell me about Rome, because that's much more preferable to me. But like, I mean, I wish it was surprising at all. But how, you talked about law earlier too. So like, what was going on there in terms of like, what they were doing with laws and disabled people?
Oh my God, there's so much going on. So specifically, I look at, again, this intersection of disability and slavery, because I think it's such a potent like intersection of social positions that really shows how disability is constructed by the requirements of different bodies at different times. And this is really interesting and really clear when it comes to slavery, in that there was some in how disability was constructed in relation to enslaved people. So I should go back. The social model makes the difference between impairment and disability. So impairment is a bodily difference that may or may not cause a functional impairment. So you might not have a hand, or you might have a facial difference that, offensively would be referred to as a deformity. And I'll come back to how tattoos kind of were incorporated in this framework of disability in Rome, because that's fascinating.
Yeah.
And then the disability, which is like the social consequence of that. So stuff about disability and slavery in Rome is set out in Book 21 of Justinian's Digest, which is a compilation of all these rulings of Roman law, and it's one of our main sources. And it referenced something called the Edict of the Curule Aediles, which is, again, these laws about buying and selling enslaved people with defects and hidden defects.
Ooh.
Yeah, I know. Rome is never beating the... It's never beating the allegations. Yeah, but what's really interesting is how it separates impairment and disability depending on the functional consequence of the impairment. So there's one bit where someone says, I can't remember exactly which jurist, because there are a lot of them, says it's not enough for someone to be born with a hand whose fingers are all joined together. It has to present a functional impairment. So you could be born with a bodily difference, but depending on how it affected the way you worked or the way you lived your life, it might not be considered disabling. And then this is really interesting, because you go, okay, what about two people who had the same functional impairment, but they had different coping mechanisms?
Yeah.
And obviously adaptations are guided by so much else about your body, like flexibility, for example. Does that mean one of them would be considered disabled and one of them doesn't? And it just shows how this idea of disability rests so much on these social expectations of bodies, which is, it's fascinating. And then there's another example, which is really interesting, of fertility, right?
Ooh.
Yeah. Sorry, all of this it's all very depressing.
I mean, yeah. But at least we can laugh now.
Yeah, the kind of we laugh or we'd cry.
Yeah, exactly. You have to.
Yeah. Fertility, I mean, it's such an important issue for both enslaved women and free women. So in free women, obviously fertility is really, really important, especially the higher up you go in terms of class status, right? The first case of Roman divorce recorded was due to the wife, I mean, theoretically, we don't actually know if it was her, being infertile. And the husband's like, look, I love you, but I swore this oath that I had to marry for the purposes of having children. You can't have kids, so gotta go. So
oh, great.
Yeah, so that is severely disabling if you're considered infertile, you can lose your marriage, you can lose your place in society, because your primary role as this free upper class woman is to produce legitimate heirs.
Yeah.
But that's completely different for enslaved women, right? Because enslaved families weren't legally legitimate. There wasn't this impetus to produce like a legal heir.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily disabling. They kind of distinguish between whether you're congenitally infertile, so whether you're like born like that and it's totally fine, or whether infertility is a consequence of your health failing, which was a very big thing in kind of Greek and then later Roman medicine. Infertility is the symptom of something else being wrong with your body. Don't know how they tell the difference, but that is just what comes down to us.
They also thought your womb could wander up into your shoulder. I just recorded a conversation that really fits in well with this, so I'm like, the stuff they believed about bodies broadly was sometimes pretty wild.
yeah, they're just like, oh, your health is failing, your womb's just wandered to the wrong place,
Yeah. It's
terrible
times.
In
the middle of nowhere. There's going to be a lot going on.
Just chilling. Yeah. And then there would be situations then for enslaved women in which infertility would actually be a benefit. Again, more super fun, not depressing topics, in that obviously a lot of enslaved women were sold for sex work.
Right.
In which then not being able to get pregnant.
Right.
Actually,
kind of ideal. Yeah.
Kind of ideal. And I think it's Ovid who has this thing on how pregnancy like diminishes a woman's beauty and ruins her body, and you're like, okay, cool, great.
He fucking would. Like, I'll never get over like the way that Ovid's Metamorphoses is like beautiful, and then so much else that he wrote is like, I'm kind of a shitty guy. Like, it's just like a constant battle in my brain about whether I like him or not.
Yeah, it's like, I'm a shitty guy. Here are 10 bullet points detailing my thoughts. But also, here's this, like, heartbreaking, inspiring work of literature. Enjoy, future people. Yeah. But then, what makes this idea of infertility being disabling in different situations is enslaved women could be manumitted, could become freed women. Right, and then infertility is this whole different ballgame, right?
These poor people.
I know, everybody's having a very bad time. So you could then become disabled by moving social position, basically.
But like, I mean, yes. But I feel like that phrasing is like, oh, moving social position. But it's like, imagine if you're being freed from enslavement, and the thing that made you like valuable when you were enslaved is now a disabling thing now that you're free. Like, talk about having like mixed feelings about something.
Oh my god. I hate to say it, but it actually gets worse.
Oh, of course it does.
You could say that with almost anything in Rome. You go, right. Oh, it gets worse.
That's why I like Greece.
Yeah,
I mean, yeah, Greece, I'm not saying it's much better.
Slightly less worse.
It's also that we just have less proof.
Yeah, no, that's so true. No, so there's this amazing article. Unfortunately not open access, I think, but written by Catherine Huemeler about manumission for marriage. You can see where this is going. Mm-hmm. So, and she talks about how enslaved women could be conditionally manumitted, and then there was a kind of gap between of 6 months between when they were conditionally manumitted and then the enslaver, former owner, had to marry them. Otherwise they would go back to being enslaved. And she theorizes that sometimes this 6 month gap was used to check if the woman could have children or not, and if she didn't conceive within these 6 months,
they took it back
to enslavement. Yeah.
I do think Rome is worse. I do. Like, because they just, like, Greece, I feel like all of the shitty things like this that happen in Greece were, like, shitty because they were just kind of, like, lacking in any kind of self-awareness. Whereas in Rome, I feel like a lot of the shitty things they just seem much more intentional. Like, they just seem a lot less, like, accidentally shitty. Like, I don't want to take away the power of the Greek crimes against humanity, but, like, yeah, I don't know, it just always feels less depressing than Rome.
Yeah, I mean, the attitude towards, like, Greek and Roman slavery is interesting to me, because, you know, sometimes the Greeks are constructing this whole idea of natural slavery and trying to make it all make sense as this inherent thing, whereas Rome, and in Roman law, they're like, slavery is an unnatural condition. Kind of fucked up, really, but we're still gonna do it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I guess
okay.
I just think Greece's crimes, I guess, always feel sillier to me, and maybe that's all it is that, like, they just feel, like, goofier in their horror, whereas Rome is just, like, we're horrifying. But again, I'm completely biased because I have a long-standing appreciation for Greece over Rome, but it just keeps getting cemented, is all I'm saying.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting then to study these societies that are so awful, because, I mean, I've never got the idea of, like, studying the thing you love, because to me, studying something means being, like, very critical of it.
Yeah.
And people are like, oh, you study Rome, you study classics for a living, you must love the ancient Romans. I'm like, no, they're fascinating, but they're awful. Like, this idea that you have to, like, love. Yeah, it's like if you're a mega fanboy of a philosopher, you might not actually be writing the best philosophy about them. You know,
I mean, and I think I encounter, like, a similar issue of, like, because I do love the ancient Greeks, but I also criticize them and think that they were shitty. And so people are often like, you know, if I say a bad thing about Zeus, they're like, well, how can you say you love this topic if you talk about Zeus being bad? And I'm like, because I understand complexity and, like, I can see the difference, and I can love a thing that is not perfect, and that I can also simultaneously criticize, you know?
Yeah. I think, like, you can love something as a tool for thinking with.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, you know, you might love reading mythology as a tool for thinking about all these complicated ideas. Reading mythology to think about love, or reading Ovid to think about transformations, or or
straight misogyny.
Or just straight misogyny, yeah. Yeah, you could think, okay, this raises so many issues in a really complex way.
Yeah.
But it's good to think with, but that doesn't mean that you condone it. In fact, I think you have to think with something in order to unpick and then hopefully start really deconstructing the harmful things that come out.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So what is, like, we've talked a lot about fertility and stuff, which is great and horrifying. When it comes to, like, enslaved, disabled men, like, was there anything kind of equally horrifying if they, you know, I say men, but, you know, just obviously like, don't have a uterus, people.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, the answer, you know, as we've seen with Rome, is always yes.
Yeah. I expected yes.
Yeah. So then, when you talk about eunuchs, the whole legal position, situation gets really, really interesting.
Yeah.
Because there's this disagreement about whether eunuchs were sound or unsound.
Right.
So Labeo, who's this first century jurist, he's like, unsound. You can do various returns or get kind of partial refunds on these. But that just doesn't. I know it's horrible, but that just doesn't line up with other jurist views or even reality, because we know from scholarship that eunuchs were generally considered these kind of expensive and luxury enslaved people, generally made eunuchs kind of prepubescent to preserve their beauty, so they were sold for kind of sex work.
Do you think this aligns at all with, like, because I know that, you know, there's definitely a group that were eunuch by choice, right? Like the priests of Kibali.
Yes.
Yeah, so, like, you know, do you think that their kind of heightened importance links to that at all, or?
Oh my god, yeah. So I actually just wrote a chapter on the galley in which I talk about the galley and eunuchs. Yeah, and I think so much about the galley that removes them from this acceptable social position. So being a eunuch and being enslaved, your Roman citizen will look at you and go, okay, I understand you. I understand your gendered position. It's contingent upon you being this item of property and made for this certain job, aka made to be sexually desirable. But with the galleon, you've got this kind of post-pubescent about becoming a eunuch, and then obviously they're not enslaved and they're not doing it for sexual desirability. It completely confounds the social situation, their social position, and thus becomes a disability.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, in the law, they say, okay, yeah, castration is always a defect in free men, but it's not a defect in enslaved people. And you're like, okay, so whether it's disabling entirely depends upon your social position.
Mm-hmm.
Which is, and then it raises all these questions about what happens when the enslaved eunuch ages, like becomes old and no longer fulfills the social role of like the eternal boy.
Yeah.
Like, do they then kind of age into being considered disabled because they're going to be less suitable for other types of generally like manual labor? Yeah, I just think seeing disability in how complicated it is and how wrapped up in other social structures is important in counteracting these narratives. It's like, okay, yeah, you just have people with different bodies, plonk them down, and then that's it. That's how people react to them. And it's this very kind of simplistic idea of disability history that only sees disabled people like as their impairment rather than like analyzing, okay, how does this impairment become a disability? Why is it considered disabling? And I think that's what this kind of new generation of disability scholarship is doing, and why it's so exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it really is. I obviously come at all of these things from the more mythological background, so I don't know how much of that applies in Rome, but like it's obviously so interesting, that Hephaestus is disabled in these like really interesting ways. You already mentioned my episodes with Kyle, but like I guess I was thinking about it more recently because I was in Eleusis and at the new museum there, and they have so much art of Triptolemus, and Triptolemus basically used a wheelchair, and it's pretty clearly what it is, like in every image. And I just remember, when I'm trying to think of what it would be, because it was about this Hades game, which I've never played, but basically I saw someone, it came to me via someone arguing with somebody who thought that a god using a wheelchair is like the most unbelievable thing, and like it was like all woke nonsense and all this stuff. And it's like this idea that we've like there's this idea in modern society, or people who are interacting with this stuff via reception, that like that is woke nonsense, and that it's them inserting that, even though it is very clearly from the ancient world. You can see it in imagery, like it literally, they had wheelchairs, they had all of that, in that, and they gave it to gods. So it's such an interesting thing to like it just examine the complexities of real disabled people in the ancient world as compared to the kind of like idolized versions, right? Like in Hephaestus and Triptolemus, we get these like divine versions of disabled people, and I wonder how that affected disabled people in real life, like for good and bad. It's just I thought about it, but it's like I don't know. There's no answer, I don't think. But
I mean that's so interesting. And it would be. I mean, one thing I would think about is how, I guess, Vulcan in the Roman world, I'm not sure how he wasn't really considered so much a god of health, right? I mean, you get a lot of votive offerings in the shape of various like limbs or organs, or sometimes you get them in the shape of entire bodies, and they're generally considered to be dedicated by people who had an illness in them, or had a kind of permanent impairment. But then I'd be really interested to see if we find those in the temple of Hephaestus, or whether
true.
it's he's very much kind of, it's more about the labor that he does.
Well,
and
that's
other
why
connotations.
That's why I think his is so interesting too, specifically because his impairment is so tied to his role that it seems to me like a kind of acknowledgement that people who do that role can often become impaired by their work. But it's really interesting that they gave that to a god as well, you know, and obviously like there's so much that goes into it, and we have, you know, when these things got decided versus otherwise. And I know Vulcan is like both similar and also very not that similar to Hephaestus. Like he has this whole volcanic quality that Hephaestus doesn't really have pre-Vulcan. So it's just, it's an interesting thing to imagine, you know, like maybe like was that type of disability, you know, of a man working in the forge, he gets disabled over just like the work, like was that considered different? And I know I'm just talking about Greece, so I don't expect you to have answers to any of this. It's interesting to consider those like aspects of kind of divine disability or divine impairment, because in the case of Hephaestus, it's not really a disability, it's an impairment, because he has all of these ways that he gets by, and he has people helping him and all of that. And the same with Triptolemus, you know, he's like this divine character that just rolls around in a wheelchair and he's doing great. Like it's just an interesting kind of way to think about the way it's portrayed in the ancient world. But again, and that's so specific to Greece because it's all that lives my brain.
That just really got me thinking about like why I guess it's an issue of reception. Why do we assume that all of the gods would have had these perfect bodies?
Yeah, exactly.
Like that's such a, like, we know that gods have different appearances. Some are more beautiful or less beautiful. We know that gods certainly don't have perfect personalities.
What are you talking about? They're delightful. All of them.
Yeah. So why then is bodies the place where we draw the line and go, oh, they all must have conformed to this very specific type of body, when that's just not the case for almost any other aspect of them.
Well, and it's funny because with Hephaestus, we do have the you know, bit of a storyline where he's cast off Mount Olympus because he's imperfect. So we have this like this idea that he was, you know, at least by his mother, thought poorly of, but then that's also so tied in with like all of the stuff to do with Hera and like why she would react that way. So, you know, there's so much going on, but we do have this notion that he has this impairment that she, you know, didn't like or whatever. And so like we have this kind of othering of him, but then simultaneously he is not disabled by his condition, and he is like arguably one of the most impressive gods of the pantheon. Yeah, like, you know, he can make fucking robots. And so like it's just such a fascinating thing to have the kind of both things going on there, where we are kind of told to see his disability as something to be kind of scorned, but then at the same time he is like so vitally important to like everything the gods ever did. And to me it screams of like the disconnect between like Hera's character more than it is Hephaestus's, right? Because like her like whole thing with Hephaestus is that, you know, she created him without Zeus, and she did it because she was mad that Zeus could create children without a woman. And so to me Hera's whole styling is like just the patriarchy like jamming their heel into her face, whereas Hephaestus is just like, well, that's kind of, it's almost like it becomes separated, you know, that reaction of Hera and the actual god Hephaestus and his role. Anyway, now I'm just having a lot of thought experiments in my head about Greek mythology, which I recognize is not what you're specializing in.
No, I mean, this is so interesting because it gets me thinking about something that I read. I can't remember where, about how Hephaestus's disability is kind of like a visual representation a sense of how he moves differently through the world, and also about how he thinks differently to the other Olympians, how he's got this very like creative, inquisitive, technical mind. And I just thought, okay,
yeah,
that was just a random thought, but
there's a lot going on with him. Yeah, there's just like a lot of random thoughts to be had.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I think it's so. I think the idea of the perfect body being linked to Greece and Rome is one of the reasons why the idea of ancient disabled people or an ancient disabled god is so offensive to a certain segment of people receiving it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so much at play there with the classical ideal of a body. And
yeah, but like I said, the ancient world had so many ways in which you could become disabled, and something that's really interesting that's now coming out in scholarship is kind of putting disability back in the picture, where like we have a lot of ancient authors who, you know, you would go, okay, blah blah was disabled, but actually, you know, in their letters, in their writing, they're talking about their health conditions, they're talking about the impact it has, they're talking about the things they do to mitigate it or to avoid it, and that's just not put into the narrative or considered in how it affects their other kind of worldviews. And I mean, it's a really common thing with historical figures, to kind of erase, if they're really well known for one thing, to like erase their disability, and then not think about how it shapes their worldview. But kind of bringing disability back is something that affected everyone. I think is so important.
Yeah.
In the scholarship.
Yeah, I mean, it's also, it reminds me of the argument, you know, of regarding trans people in the ancient world and just trans people broadly, right? Like it's really beneficial to everyone to recognize that people like this existed all the way back, because they've existed forever, you know, be they people who've been disabled by social societies, you know, or with impairments, or trans people, like, who, you know, don't apply necessarily in the same ways, but like just the same idea that like this has always existed. Like it's not new to recognize, you know, disability. It's not new to like recognize the humanity within it, and I think it just benefits people of today, specifically people of today, like with disabilities and stuff, to recognize that, like, in the ancient world, I mean, and again, Rome, it sounds like they handled it pretty poorly, but, you know, like I think about, you know, the whole notion of babies being, you know, exposed, whatever, thrown off a mountain because they were imperfect, and how there's that rumor that goes around, and it's not backed up by evidence. The evidence is that if a baby was disabled, they tended to care for it incredibly well, and you know, it's like, we need to remember that while these things existed, like, also so did fucking humanity, and it's only like often, you know, the laws or the legalities or those types of things that make us think that they were treated, you know, particularly poorly, and they were in the law, but that doesn't mean, you know, anything about the day-to-day life of real people.
Yeah, and then it's like, cui bono, like, who's benefiting from this idea that disabled people were ostracized and exiled from ancient society? Who benefits from this idea that you know, the ancient society was all this kind of homogenous people with very similar bodies, and now the modern day has all these diverse identities that have just been created out of nothing, you know? And then you look at kind of how, like, classical reception has come up in the histories of, like, the eugenics, or the histories of kind of racial classifications, and you go, okay, so
I see who's benefiting.
a certain imperial type is benefiting from this idea of the perfect body and the superior civilization in which weakness does not appear, and if it does appear, it's swiftly.
Yeah.
I mean,
it all comes back to imperialism and capitalism, doesn't it?
It does.
They're like, they want us to believe that disabled people weren't cared for in the ancient world, because it allows them to say that the absolute bare minimum that a lot of these countries give us is so kind and nice. They're doing such good things for us.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, it's just like they didn't have the like full-blown notion of capitalism back then. Everything was different.
And it says so much about the centrality of work in different social social
yes,
contexts.
That's so true.
Yeah, I mean, under capitalism, the ability to work is such a determiner of whether or not you are a good citizen. This idea of like being a good member or a contributing member of the community, and how it has to be done by performing labor in certain ways. But the idea that wasn't the case throughout all of history is just, oh my god, completely undermines a lot
the
of
capitalist
beliefs.
mentality.
The kind of idea of individualism, this idea that you must be self-sufficient. Obviously we are all interdependent and we rely on other people's labor for so much of our life. We've just drawn this arbitrary line where it's like, no. If you rely on other people's labor in these ways, you are very bad. In my ways is good, but in your ways is very bad. But this idea of this kind of this hyper individuality is, again, it's a product of modernity. And then it's so interesting to see how disability is accommodated for when, say, the economic unit is moves towards being the family rather than the individual. Or the location of this production is kind of in the home or in a family run business, where people are constantly adjusting for and compensating for each other's differences, like teamwork. You say, oh, blah in my team doesn't like doing this, I'm good at this, therefore I'll do this, but blah is really good at that, so they can do that. Like, oh, so we do actually accommodate for people's preferences and their strengths in so many other areas of life. And you can kind of flip it, like the argument that the kind of the far right will make about disability. They'll be like, look, the ancient world, they just didn't have time for people who weren't at peak economic efficiency, so just had to be exposed. You go, actually, the ancient world didn't have time for not using or not having everybody be involved.
It's like the difference. I mean, I think we're just losing the definition of society, right? Like back then it was just that, like, people didn't always have it good, but they worked together. Like there was a notion of like contributing to each other, and less of that individualism that we have now. And like this idea that like, also this idea that like everything is better now in the current West is like fucking hilarious and still perpetuated all the time, right? Like, well, you're lucky you don't live 100 years ago. And it's like, I don't know, am I?
Like the idea that technical innovation, which we undoubtedly have, necessarily means that we've had the corresponding only positive social innovation. You're like, not entirely true. I mean, your point about society just got me thinking about that Thatcher quote. There is no such thing as a society. There are only individuals and families. And you're like, oh, okay, we can see the repercussions of that on modern Britain. I know
that's a Margaret Thatcher quote.
Oh yeah, one of her many classics.
Wow, she was a great lady, wasn't she? Jesus fuck. It makes me think like I don't know, just no, I'm not going to go into women that are agents of the patriarchy, but
but if you did, she would be
if I did, I got some names. No, but to loop it back to Rome, I guess, if we should. Like I would love to know more about, I guess, do we know much about like the actual lived experiences, or are we working mostly off of these like really horrifying laws that were implicated? And that's not the right word, but
well, I think unfortunately I'm bringing the horrors because of how I look at disability as this thing that's constructed by social structures. And for that, I say, the social model is really useful, but it is less useful for the emotional experiences or the everyday experiences of people, in which things like chronic pain would be impactful, or pain in walking, or pain of if you've had a break.
Any invisible illness too. That would be like that's obviously the one that like most touches my life, and I can't. It's bad now. I can only imagine back then.
Yeah, and I think that's when we need to start reading these ancient texts that talk about the life of, I don't know, Cicero, Suetonius, blah, 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 blah. We need to start focusing on how they thought about their health and well-being, and how it would fit and how it impacted the actions they take. So, I mean, like, people would leave Rome in certain seasons and go and stay elsewhere because the city becomes, in the summer, this kind of hub of illness. So you go, okay, actually, people are taking these very concrete social actions to avoid illness, or to kind of negotiate like their bodies and their conditions. But there's so much work to be done, and there's so much, and again we run into the problem of evidence, and this is where archaeology would be obviously really, really helpful. I mean, Jane Draycott, I think she talks about Rome, but she's written about prostheses in antiquity, and how by looking at, you know, what the prostheses look like, the kind of wear and tear on them, where they're found, you can get information about how people use them and what was going on in their daily life. Yeah. So I think that's when we have to turn to the material evidence to get the sense of what it's like for your average person. We can, you know, divine this very personalized health experience of elite writers through reading their texts in which they mention themselves, or the texts in which they write about other people. But the health of the lower classes as an individual experience seems much less important. It's more important as a kind of social issue, which again we see throughout history, the idea of like the degeneration of the working classes. That's that kind of perspective. To bring it back to the horrors.
Never can stray too far.
And then again, obviously, I'm very hyping up this new generation of classical scholarship or disability, but with so much of it being done by disabled people, that's absolutely crucial, I think, to recovering the lived experiences, because you're just thinking about thoughts occur to you based on your own experience, and you go, oh, maybe this happened, that it just wouldn't occur to someone who didn't have those experiences. Like, for example, I don't have chronic pain. I don't know about navigating life with chronic pain, so certain things just wouldn't occur to me in reading the sources. So and that's again so important, just because so much of scholarship is people looking and go, oh, this reminds me of something I saw or something I experienced, thus I will pursue it. And the ideas that don't get sparked because certain people aren't being put in a position to write scholarship means that all this work is just being left out. So I mean, and there's been a lot of work on material objects in museums. In the UK, we have something called like the Curating for Change Fellowship, and people have done really useful things in making displays on ancient disability, and having like other disabled people come in and go, oh, this is similar to my experience because blah, maybe it was like this, and these are just sparking new ideas, new areas of investigation. Maybe, you know, obviously not everything's going to be similar. Maybe some investigations come to nothing, but it's about this producing of curiosity. And it's so important.
It is though, and like I know what you're talking about, even just from my own work. Like, you've funny timing, because I just recently finished my, you know, usually I do them like twice a year. I do a Q&A episode, or a couple of them. And I love them because people give me their specific insights via their questions that then allows me to think about the topics in completely different ways than I would have naturally, because you need these different minds in order to reach certain places. And when it comes to studying classics, like, you know, for the last couple hundred years, it's been so heavily dominated by like wealthy white men that like they're not thinking about that stuff, or if they are, it's a fluke. Like it's not necessarily going to generate the same ideas as somebody from all of these, like, or just people rather from all of these different backgrounds and life experiences and everything. Like, you know, we're going to get so much more out of the ancient world. We're going to get so much more out of the ancient texts and stuff. So yeah, I mean, you've got such great examples on the studying disability so specifically, but I think that applies to so much in this field in the best possible way, you know. Like, I mean, it applies to studying women in the field, studying gender diversity, and like just queer studies. All of that, right, is just all coming out more because we have all of these different minds getting curious and looking for answers, and it's just, it's very cool.
It's the only way that the study of ancient history is gonna be able to accurately, so far as any history can do, accurately reflect the complexity and of the ancient world, of everything that was going on there, which is, you know, just as complex as it is now, and can't be simplified down. So you need an even broader swathe of people who are thinking about it, and having ideas.
Yeah, I mean, it's
various perspectives.
It's why, like, now, you know, we're slowly breaking down the idea that, like, you know, every Athenian man was some, like, brilliant, like generator of Western civilization. Like, you know, it's, and even just, you know, I think about it a lot in terms of how Christianity affected the study of classics, and, like, what things have been skewed for so long based on, like, the Christian notions that went along with studying it in the West. And, you know, like, the way that just belief in God affects studying mythology, you know, it's like, obviously there are ways for it not to, I don't want to suggest that, but like, but especially in the Victorian period, like, nah, you're believing in God, and it is implicating in every single thing that you are studying. You're like a rich white man, that's the only way you can be in this field. You believe in God, you believe that women are lesser, and like, that's going to affect everything that you study. And so now, like, the more open we all become as a society, like, the more we're going to be able to understand the ancient world, because spoilers, like, they didn't have Christianity well, in ancient Greece, and they didn't have, you know, like, they didn't have these modern notions of whiteness, of Western civilization, of like everything that now informs the way we learn, like, didn't fucking exist back then. Like, you know.
And what I think then is interesting in how it can have this then flipped effect. So, my experience in the modern day informs how I think about the ancient world and how I generate questions about the ancient world that I don't then investigate. But then my investigations of the ancient world, you know, thinking about how, in this case, disability relates to economic labor, or relates to ideas of individuality or the family, that then gets me thinking about, okay, what kind of changes can we then make in the modern day which might move us further away or closer to these dynamics. Being able to think outside the box of the modern day is spurred by asking interesting questions about societies that are very, very different from our own. And I mean,
and remembering they're different.
That's why they're so that's one of the reasons why they're so fascinating.
Well, like, that's why I say I love ancient Greece, because what I love is just all of the things I get to learn, and like the just everything, you know. But it's not because I like idolize them. It's just because it's like fucking interesting and so different, and remembering how different it was, and like, the more you learn, like, the more wonderful it is.
Like,
I
mean, I think part of studying, it's not part of the joys of studying the ancient world, is having to put yourself in a position and try and think in all these thought structures that are so alien to you. It produces not the kind of empathy that is approving, but a kind of empathy that gets you used to thinking in very different ways and becoming, hopefully, and fingers crossed, more open-minded to alternative ways of thinking. And you might investigate this one alternative way of thinking and go, okay, actually, I think that this is morally bad and should not be adapted. But I think that's what we sometimes lose or what has been lost in the study of the ancient world, when they just wanted to assimilate how similar it is to blah, how similar it is to us. Because, I mean, in terms of the British Empire, how similar we are to the Roman Empire, because we're also such a great conquering body.
So funny to me, like, just the Romans conquered Britain. Like, why did they just go then turn around and be like, well, we're gonna do it but worse? Like, that's just wild. It's so tied up in the myth of Western civilization, right?
Mhm.
Because it is so hard for so many people in the West to separate themselves from that notion, and that notion is so like, I mean, I'm having trouble finding the right word, but like it creates such a bias in the studying of the ancient world, is to like believe inherently that they are the origins of Western civilization. Like, if you go into it with that, you're going to have so many preconceived ideas. Like, it's just so wrapped up in these issues. I mean, you've also studied the far right, so like, like, it's so, that's where all of that stems from, is this idea that Greece and Rome invented the West, that they like were this little bubble that was like never surrounded by brown people. Like, it's just, it's such a dark idea. And when you go into it like that, with that, that's when you get like all of the horror, but stepping out and being like, wait, like, let's look at some historical reality and revisit what we might be looking at in the ancient world.
And that also completely structures what we think of as the ancient world. I've just been more work recently on like Islam in the ancient world, and how Islam isn't considered something that's classical, even though there's huge overlaps between Islamic regions and the classical world, and loads of interaction, but it's not considered part of the classical because of the way, like, in modernity, Islam is considered outside the West, even though obviously there are multiple European Islamic countries, etc., etc. So it's like, who then is included in the ancient world, and how does that get us thinking about separation and differences and interactions between different cultures, and where we draw the line between these different cultures? It
reminds me of something that's happening right now in the world.
Just
I don't know, it's not related.
Just another mass disabling event going on in the world.
All due to the West.
And I mean, this is one of the reasons why I love talking about ancient disability, because if you approach it in a political way, it really does tie into almost every question we have about history, almost every question we have about the classics. One thing that I really object to in scholarship about disability is how it's siloed into being this niche that never relates to anything else. They're like, oh, okay, we're going to study this disabled person, but we're going to take them, kind of almost out of the context that they exist in. And it feels so almost patronizing in a sense.
Oh, absolutely.
Disabled people can only be studied about their disability and not as kind of an actor in a part of a social ecosystem. I was going to say part of that is that I think right now disability scholarship, apart from this new wave that I think is coming, suffers from edited volume disease, in which most people kind of like write one chapter on disability, they never really think about it again in their scholarship, and you're like, oh, okay, actually we need people who are really thinking about this deeply for a number of years. But hopefully now that's happening.
Yeah, well, it reminds me of like women's studies 10 years ago,
Exactly.
And so you think like it seems, I mean, at least in that case, it's probably gotten better, I think. I don't know, I did my degree 10 years ago, so it's maybe not like the easiest to compare. But like, my understanding is it's gotten better, where we're just we're getting closer to the idea that just, women were people in the ancient world. Weird. Yeah. They don't have to be siloed into this one specific topic, because they were half of the population. And it's the same thing with disability, like, hopefully we are getting to that point where it's like, well, they existed in the ancient world, and thus they are, this studying disability in the ancient world is just as valid as studying anything else in the ancient world, because it was a thing that existed in the ancient world.
It's not something that's a sideline or unimportant to the big conversations that are happening. I mean, I think most kind of studies of new ideas or minority groups probably go through that phase where it's super siloed and you're just like, yes, at least we get to study women or disabled people a little bit, and then it kind of broadens out to being accepted as this essential part of the social ecosystem. So like, fingers crossed.
It's always so funny to me because like I just think I don't understand how everyone doesn't exist in my brain, and I think it's because I have undiagnosed autism. But like
many such cases.
I was thinking about it earlier when you were talking about, I forget even how, but it was just made me whatever you were saying made me think of like the autism tests they give people, and how like a lot of people who are, you know, dealing with this later in life like fail the tests because they misunderstand the questions, because they've developed all of these ways to like get around what the question is getting at, and it's like, well, I don't have that problem because of this and this and this that I've been doing for 20 years.
Anyway, I don't have this problem because of my elaborate coping mechanisms that I made to deal with this problem. What are you talking about?
So it's not here. I just noticed Michaela says me. Where was I going with that? Brains.
I mean, your comment about like diagnosis or discovering disability later in life just gets me thinking again about how much future potential there is in studying disability, because we're learning about it, and knowledge about disability is evolving so fast in the modern day.
Well, and this is what my point was, because it came back, so thank you for saying that, because my point is just that like I think it's so fucking interesting to learn about these groups of people, you know, be they, you know, disabled people in the ancient world, women, enslaved people in the ancient world, like any, like I don't know why I linked those two together, but I just mean like, you know, the on the margins of society type people. Like I want to learn everything about them. Like I am not particularly interested in the men of ancient Greece unless they're Euripides, but the reason I'm interested in Euripides is because he cared about the other people. So it's like, okay, you know, and so to me, I'm just like, I don't see how anyone cannot, well, and it's also, I'm lucky because I get to study whatever the fuck I want in the ancient world, but like I just want to learn all of it. And so I'm looking forward to more people being in the field, but also like more people who, you know, as somebody who's 36, only just in the past few years learned to have ADHD, and now I'm like 98% sure I have autism, but I'm just not gonna go bother getting the diagnosis. But like every test I've ever taken says she's sure, you know. So like I think there's so many people like me right now, and also like people in the younger generation who are coming up in a very different world, you know, where this stuff is just like, it's just much more broadly like talked about, and that's so great. And so the more people are coming up in this field now, and of the younger generations, like I think I mean the better it's going to be, the more we're going to look at this stuff, especially when the really old and crabby ones start to die off, you know?
I think I experienced this in teaching. So I teach undergrads, and I mainly teach third year, and they're all so wonderful. I get to teach them about really interesting topics. I taught a module on Greek and Roman slavery. I've taught about gender, taught about classical reception. And what I think is really interesting is the kind of the questions they're asking are very different to ones I would expect to get if I presented similar material in, say, a seminar in front of like my established colleagues, in which I would, you know, after presenting my paper on the galley, I'd be like, okay, this is what it means to be transgender. You may have heard of this thing called being transgender. Whereas with the kids, you know, I say in my mid-20s,
it just keeps getting worse, but also better.
Yeah, exactly. There's so much that they already understand and accept just because of the changing way of the world, and then it leads them to ask me these really interesting questions that, because I'm thinking about how I might present this to an established audience, I just didn't even consider.
No, I can only imagine that, because I mean, even just from my experience, like this just made me think of it, and so I'm gonna like make myself seem really old, but also point out like the way that the world is changing and fast. It's great. Like I did my degree, like I started in 2009, so the story I've got is probably from like 2010, 11, and I just remember I had this professor who went by they them pronouns, and that was like probably the first time I had heard of that. And it wasn't so much like I obviously like knew very well of transgender people, but it was more that using they them and having that be like a new thing I had to learn about. And like, you know, it was great. And then I had like this great experience of like, you know, adapting to that and understanding. But like now it's so common that nobody's going into a university classroom and being like, oh really, I'm surprised. Like I just feel like, at least certainly, and maybe it's just the circles I'm in now where I'm like, now everybody's queer. Like, and you know, it's so interesting seeing those differences. And, you know, I'm only 36 and I can tell the enormous difference from that's when I was in university, but like, oh my God, when I was in high school, like Jesus, like the way things have changed in the last 20 years due to the internet, you know, for all its flaws, but it really does connect people in this way where you get to learn about other people's experiences in a way that inherently makes people so much more empathetic and understanding and interested, curious, like you're saying about your students, and like, curious to ask these questions because they have so much more base knowledge.
Just having the baseline stuff done is so valuable. Yeah. Because then you don't have to constantly be re-saying or republishing, in the case of academia, these arguments that, you know, okay, this is what everybody that I would speak to would already intuitively know is true. But you have to publish it because it hasn't been recognized in the writings of academia. And you're like, could this time have been spent doing something more innovative? Yes, definitely could.
yeah, exactly. Like, think about how I had to get the baseline, and it was just because things were so different. And now it's like, everyone just like has that, and it's so refreshing and like encouraging, and it makes me feel very old, but in a good way, in a like, I'm glad the younger generation.
I feel that.
I'm only 36. That's fine. Yeah. It's just, you know, it's also incredibly interesting. This conversation has very much gone off the rails in the most enjoyable possible way. I want to pull us back to Rome to kind of.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
No. There was nothing to do with you. There is no need to apologize. And also, like, again, I love it. This is my favorite thing about conversations is when we can just
It's because disability is a stepping stone to all other social issues. This conversation has demonstrated the entanglement of disability.
There you go.
In everything.
Yeah, exactly. So no, like truly, this is my favorite part of conversations, but I will also bring it back to wrap up around Rome. So like, is there anything, you know, that you haven't shared yet about the way Rome handles disabilities that you're like, no, you have to hear this either because it's horrifying or funny or just like, I don't know, a pet obsession of yours?
Yeah, well, I mean, there are two bits. We'll start off with the one that's like more funny, but also horrifying, because there's no kind of distinction about that. But this is tattooing, which my undergrad enjoyed.
Yeah, you mentioned tattoos.
Yeah,
thank you.
I have a tattoo. I think you have a tattoo. So, you know, it's all all coming together.
I think you have a tattoo is one of the most subtle things anyone's ever said to me. Meanwhile, my like finger has been like, I can't even show a single finger without a tattoo. Oh, my thumbs are untattooed. We're fine. Okay. Anyway, sorry. Yes, I have a handful.
So there's still progress to be made in getting everything tattooed, is what I'm hearing. Yeah. So I mean, when I was talking about disability as being in relation to the other social positions you occupy, so for free women, especially of a kind of upper class, your social position, the most important thing, is being expected to produce legitimate heirs, thus infertility, incredibly disabling. And this means when it comes to slavery, I argue that there are disabilities that are unique to slavery. So, and I'll get into the more kind of serious ones after this, but tattooing is really interesting. So
I am so excited.
Yeah, I know. So tattooing and less often branding were done as punishments for enslaved people. So, and they were viewed then in the same way as facial differences or deformities viewed, and in their consequence they were significantly physically disabling without causing any actual impairment. Like, it's not the same as chopping off someone's foot, for example.
Yeah.
In this case, tattoos, sometimes they'd be across the forehead, but they'd be in a visible face. Yeah. They were essentially like a manifestation, a physical manifestation of the enslaved person's histories and their crimes in in quotation marks. They're often done as punishment for attempting to run away. So they're this permanent mark on the body of criminality and rebellion, similar to you get say marks of the whip from other physical punishment. And it's like one of the reasons why tattooing is so contextually important in the Roman context is this idea of the free male subject and his corporal integrity, the impenetrable body. If you're a Roman man, you don't get penetrated.
No, you do the penetrating.
No penetration. You do the penetration. You don't get your. Sorry, you're gonna have to cut this bit. But and you don't get your skin penetrated either. That's like the ultimate sign that you've lost your, mastery over your embodiment, having this permanent mark on you. It's a sign of humiliation. And there's one. This is actually a Greek example, but it's so striking that I always mention it. And it's recorded by this guy called Diogenes Laertius in the 3rd century AD. He writes about the lives of the eminent philosophers, and then there's this man called Bion of Borysthenes, probably butchered that Greek pronunciation.
I mean, I respect it.
Whose father was a freedman, and he had a tattoo as a punishment. And Bion described his father as having no face, but only the writing on his face. And you're like, oh wow, okay, so.
It's horrifying.
It's incredibly, and I mean these kind of visible markings would obviously influence their future treatment. It would impair their mobility. They'd be constantly being watched. It's a sign of watch me. You're made hyper visible. It's harder to potentially change position because you're a lot harder to sell to a new enslaver because your mark is troublesome. So you're unable to escape this person who's disfigured you, or you're then sold into kind of even more dangerous or kind of lower labor like the mines, which just they're a death factory. And even in rare cases where people who have been tattooed as slaves were freed, there was another law called the Lex Alia Sentinia, and that's in 4 BCE. It assigned a lesser status to freedmen who'd been physically marked when they were slaves. So it continues then to have this social consequence, this disabling consequence. Into then this very changed social status. And I think it's so interesting to think about the ways in which disability is and is not connected to practical, in a sense, impairments, because in a lot of ways that would be more disabling for someone than, say, missing some fingers.
Because it's just that socializing, that social disability, like the thing that's just inflicted on you. I mean, I know like that's the concept generally is that society that inflicts, but that's so specifically something inflicted, like
it just lays these dynamics so bare.
Yes.
And especially, so I mean, my last bit is the last section of this paper that I've loved writing, and it's about what disabilities were considered most disabling in terms of enslaved people, and we've talked about how physical disabilities could be disabling depending on their impact. The person with the joined fingers who can still make use of the hand, etc. But what really comes up in contracts for slave sales, and it comes up in the law, is wandering and flight. So they were considered the desire to do it, the action of it was considered a disability. And I mean this has been taken up in New World slavery. There was a term called drapetomania, which was this obviously like super racist theory that Black people had this urge to run away from slavery, even though it was what was best for them. And it was and it was considered like a mental disability. The horrors.
Oh my god.
Yeah. So the horrors persist.
Are you saying they were dehumanized, maybe just a little bit? Oh my
Yeah.
god. I react with sarcasm because
It's yeah. And again, it's another example of how the classical slavery and classical attitudes towards disability have this kind of long-ranging impact. So when they're talking about impairments and disabilities in law and in contracts for enslaved people, they always mention whether the enslaved person has wandered, which is like being persistently kind of absent and not telling anyone where they're going, or whether they've tried to flee, and they have to be. They're considered the same as epilepsy in that they have to be declared. But then what gets even more interesting is how they define wandering and fleeing, because you don't actually have to like go through with taking the action. It's more the intention to do it.
God.
So I can't remember the phrase. So someone who has hidden, here it is, Proculus, who's another jurist, he's talking about the case of an enslaved person who's hidden in his master's house to find an opportunity to escape. And the quote is, though he could not be regarded as already in flight, being still in the house, correct, he was nonetheless a fugitive, because it was his intention to flee.
See, this is just why I think the Romans are shittier. I mean, I'm sure the Greeks did this stuff, but we don't have it written down. But like the level of depravity there.
There's this very technical level of thinking about the horrors.
Human beings,
yeah. Which I think is once it's committed to words and law in these ways, is very, very stark.
Yeah.
But then there was this legitimate way of running away. So it's all right if you don't have to just declare this enslaved person to run away. If they've run away to a place, the quote is, frequented by those who declare themselves for sale. So there were places where you could go to escape that specific enslaver, but still be in the social condition of slavery.
Wow. So that was like an established thing?
Yeah. I mean, it kind of, you could see the logic from the perspective of the enslavers, have this safety valve so you're not constantly getting murdered by your enslaved people, because wouldn't blame them.
No.
So again, It's so much about intention, and whether your intention is to escape a specific person or whether it's to escape the institution of slavery.
Right.
And again, it's talked about in the same context, with the same language as other mental disorders in Roman law. And it's just so interesting how things that are obviously we wouldn't consider wanting to run away from being enslaved to be a disability, but how things that are undesirable from an elite perspective to their social inferiors are like perceived or constructed as being a disability, as a way to make it this very negative thing that's rooted in the body and the mind of the enslaved person, rather than being like a social consequence.
Also, it's like a fucking human reaction. Like, I'm sorry, emperor. Like, let's turn the tables and see how you feel. Like,
yeah.
It just, I mean, it's the same, obviously, as like all of the imperial bullshit of the last couple thousand years. Like, this idea that, once you have the power, like, you no longer kind of, I don't even know how to describe it, because it's just so fucking unhinged, I suppose, is all I can say.
And I just think it's another aspect of disability. Like, obviously it's so important to study the lived experiences of disabled people with, say, similar disabilities to your own, or chronic pain, or physical disability, etc., but it's also really important to study what has been constructed as a disability in certain periods that wouldn't be considered a disability now. So, like hysteria,
Yeah.
Like, we no longer diagnose women with hysteria for the mental illness of hating being locked in an abusive marriage, What is considered a disability is so reflective of these social conditions. And once you start thinking about it like that, this whole other world of looking at society and social relations just kind of opens up to you, and hopefully leads you to radical and liberatory conclusions. But we shall see.
Well, if you're listening to my show, you're close, I hope. Otherwise, you're not paying attention. Well, I mean, I feel like that's a perfect line to wrap it up on. Thank you so much for doing this. This was fascinating. I love that we just had like a full-blown chat about capitalism and everything. I mean, I'm here for all of it. Thank you so much. Is there anything you want to share with my listeners about where they can learn more, read more, anything like that?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. So for disability theory, this is just not an academic book, but a normal book. I would recommend Mike Oliver and Colin Barnes' The New Politics of Disablement. That sets out the very classic kind of social model relationship to capitalism, a bit of disability history. And then one thing that Liv, you might also like, is a new book that's come out recently. It's on my shelf. No, it's not here. Because I got it out because I knew that you would. Think about it. Empire of Normality, which talks about neurodiversity and capitalism. Which I think, given...
Listen, I'm slightly interested in that.
Given the demographic of listeners, I feel like may appeal to some people, and that's by Robert Chapman. And in terms of disability in the ancient world, I'm pretty certain Debbie Sneed's article on ramps and one on debunking these myths of infanticide, there are written up in open access or popular locations. Those are fascinating.
Yeah, she's a great resource for disability studies.
And Alexandra Morris has just had an academic monograph out on disability in Egypt. But really, it's a lot of the exciting work is going on in museums, and unfortunately, a lot of the exciting work is still to come. It's in the publishing pipeline. So I mean, stay tuned for hopefully some really exciting stuff coming out. And I think this is an area where it shouldn't just stay confined to academic journals. So it's so important that it's made public, and also that people ask these questions about disability, and make it clear to the powers that be that this is a topic that is interesting to people and valued.
Valuable.
And if any listener is an editor of a magazine or publication, commission disabled people to write about disability. It'll be good. That's an important message.
You'd think it could be obvious, and
yet.
Here we are. Well, thank you so much again. This was really so much fun. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Yeah, I've had a great time.
Nerds, thank you all so much for listening. That was such a fun conversation. I, as I said, have minimal brain capacity right now, so we'll jump right into Let's Talk About Myths, Baby is written and produced by me, Liv Albert. Michaela Pengawish is the Hermes to my Olympians, the producer. Select music by Luke Chaos. The podcast is part of the iHeart Podcast Network. Listen on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. We have a new newsletter. I'm still figuring it out. We sent one out, but it needs some work. Anyway, get in on the next one. mythsbaby.com/newsletter. I am Liv, and I love this shit very much.